I mentioned Mervyn Doc Wheatley in my introduction a few minutes ago. Sherie Hart is a granddaughter of Doc, and she has kindly agreed to deliver the address today. Please welcome Sherie. Can't win with this.
Because I asked him to lower it for me. Thank you, Rob, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you, Colin, also. I'm Merv Wheatley's eldest of 3 granddaughters. I'm here today with Merv's 2 daughters, Glenys and Meryl, and my sister Julie, and also my 2 daughters, Sophie and Delissa, my cousin Wendy, and my son Joel could not be here. Merv Doc Wheatley was the 5th child from a family of 10 children, 7 boys and 3 girls. All 7 brothers volunteered to serve in the war effort. All 7 were actively engaged and all returned home to tell their stories. The second youngest brother, Norm Wheatley, is alive and well today, aged 100, and lives in his own home in Canberra. On the 22nd of January 2006, Merv Wheatley was a pretty fit and healthy 93-year-old. He was living unaided in his own home in Cloverdale, had all of his faculties, and was still reading the newspaper each day without glasses, unlike me. In fact, his GP had just told him that week that he had the heart rate and the blood pressure of an 18-year-old. On that Sunday morning, Merv poured himself a small glass of whiskey from a bottle he kept for medicinal purposes. He took a nip and left the rest. Merv then took his well-oiled 303 into his very well-maintained back garden and stood under the lemon tree that he loved. I've outlived my mates. I've lived by the gun. I should die by the gun. Grandad made this very matter-of-fact statement to me and to his 2 daughters over the last few years of his life. I would always say, "For goodness sakes, Grandad, what a thing to say. Imagine the mess we would have to clean up." Well, when my time's up, that's how I should go. I would object some more, and the conversation would end. None of us ever really thought he would do it. Well, he did. He also made sure to call the police just before he stepped outside to his beloved lemon tree to make sure none of us would have to clean up the mess. Was Grandad's end due to the war? I suspect not fully, but I'm pretty sure it contributed to it. Grandad was born in 1912. He was 28 by the time he arrived in Dili, East Timor. He'd had a pretty hard life up until that point. At the age of 12, he was pulled out of school and sent to work on a dairy farm down south to earn money to send back to his mother to raise his 5 younger siblings. Grandad resented not getting the amount of education afforded to his older siblings and his younger siblings. I remember him reading Albert Facey's A Fortunate Life, and Grandad said Albert had it pretty easy. He went from one farm to another as a child. He moved north and worked in the mines in Kalgoorlie and on stations in the northern Pilbara. Eventually he took up roo shooting. He would say, "You had to be a good shot to make a living. You did not waste good ammo on poor shots." By the time Grandad stepped off the boat at Dili, East Timor, he'd been fending for himself for 16 years. He'd learned to live off the bush. He'd spent significant periods on his own, and he was a damn good shot. Knowing Grandad, he would have had a really good work ethic, a strong and vocal opinion on what was right and what was wrong, and he would have been ready and raring to go. However, nothing can quite prepare you. When Grandad returned to Perth on leave after East Timor, and again at the end of the war, Nana told us he would suddenly be overcome with uncontrollable shaking. He would make his way to the nearest pub for a quick couple of shots of whiskey to calm his nerves every time this happened. My mum Glenys remembers from her childhood, Grandad would lie on a camp bed under the veranda of their Byford property, covered in perspiration, suffering from bouts of malaria, and yelling out while hallucinating. However, my mum Glenys and my aunt Merrill say he never actually talked about the war while they were growing up. He kept it all to himself. Instead, he threw himself into work. He established a market garden and an orchard, and not one to ever do anything by half, he became known as Top Price Merv. The family moved to Perth, and Grandad joined the standard gauge railway for a few years, built fiberglass boats until he could no longer stand the skin irritation, and then got to work installing deep sewerage around Perth. He soon moved into a supervisory role and was known as Manhole Merv. I was born in 1970. I loved visiting my grandparents. They had a half-acre block in Cloverdale, and 50% of it was literally covered in neatly ordered rows of vegetables and fruits. His strawberries and his rock melons were to die for. Grandad was a pretty feisty character. He always did the right thing, otherwise you're in trouble. And he was an absolute stickler for punctuality. Lunch at 12 o'clock on the dot, and don't be a minute late. He also enjoyed a beer and he could chat with anybody. He was always doing something interesting and telling interesting tales. He often had interesting visitors, and I loved to sit at the table with the adults and listen in. Still, he never spoke of the war. As I got older, I was absolutely fascinated by two very large, deadly looking, but beautiful, jewel-encrusted Japanese swords he kept wrapped up in his wardrobe. When I asked what the war was like, he would simply say, "Kill or be killed," and would talk fondly of the Timorese people, and in particular of Montello, the young boy who stayed with him throughout his time in East Timor. I remember Keithy Hayes visiting and telling me about his bayoneting and how he survived thanks to a Timorese lady who tended his wounds. I pestered Grandad to tell me more about the war. Eventually, in the early 1990s, when I was in my early 20s, I spent a number of consecutive weekends with him, writing down a memoir of some of his experiences in East Timor. It was an edited version of events. There were some events he would briefly mention and then simply not expand upon them. Other events that I would write down as he spoke, but then he would insist that I cross them out. They were either too terrible to mention, not appropriate in his eyes, or in some cases he was a bit unsure of their accuracy and he'd prefer to say nothing. I kick myself to this day for not going home and keeping my own separate notes of the unedited version. During those days, he relived what he was speaking to me. At times he was extremely angry, and at other times he was completely disgusted with the events that took place. At other times he was actually pretty pleased with himself, and Rob said it, he was very happy. And at other times he was very sad. He told of accidental deaths, commanding decisions that he thought were atrocious, and of his overwhelming desire at times to retaliate and to kill others while he was there. He also told of the abhorrent treatment of the local Timorese by the Japanese, and of fearing for his life while caught in the middle of a local civil war. Most of all, he was devastated at leaving behind young Montello, and he was also devastated for leaving behind his sniper rifle. It was the best rifle he ever had. on the beach the day they left East Timor. He also said he should not be alive. The night the Japanese landed in Dili, Grandad was in the middle of helping Jack Sheehan run a 2-up game. Grandad was likely to be up late into the night, so Bob Chalmers offered to take Grandad's turn to drive the supply truck to Dili at 9 a.m. the next morning. Bob Chalmers was murdered by the Japanese on that trip to Dili. Another time, Grandad was assigned with a small group of men to keep watch over the village of Morbisi, which was occupied by the Japanese. They were living in a small hut and would take turns spending a day at a lookout post on the hill overlooking the village. One day, Andy Smeaton offered to take Grandad's turn keeping watch with George Thomas. It was that day that the Japanese attacked. Grandad and the rest of the group, including Taylor, Sadler and Elder, managed to escape, but Smeaton and Thomas, who were positioned at the lookout, were never ever seen again. I then understood why it took Grandad 50 years to really open up and talk about the war. I also understood why he booby-trapped his home. There were gongs set up on the triggers around the house. If someone walked down the side of the house, they would inadvertently always set off a trigger and a loud bang would ensue. He also told me if someone had the gall to lift the tiles on the roof and try to break in to the manhole, well, they were going to get more than they bargained for, and it wasn't a gong. He always maintained his guns. He also built his own handheld pistol, and it worked well. Our lives were full of Grandad's anecdotes and lessons from the war. I would like to end with some of them. Frogs save lives. When the frogs go quiet, watch out. You should always plan ahead, scope out your area. Always, always have an escape route. Keep your body in shape. You don't need a gym. Imagine you're locked in a small cell and there's nothing. There's nothing in that cell. You have to exercise your body and you have to exercise your mind. He would then literally demonstrate to all of us, imagining lifting and pulling and stretching and would give us a lesson on what we would need to do. He would say to us, you are your mind. It's mind over matter. Get control of your mind. You have to stay positive. There is no such thing as can't. There is only can. I brought you up tough. You're strong. You can stand on your own 2 feet. I've lived by the gun. I should die by the gun.